The Atlantic Ocean stretches west of the Pillars of Hercules, that ancient gateway where the Mediterranean world ends and the open sea begins, empty and uninterrupted beneath a pale horizon that seems to extend forever into distances the ancient mind could barely fathom. Stand at the edge of the known world in the centuries before our common era, where the Rock of Gibraltar rises from the southern shore of Iberia and the mountains of North Africa loom across the strait, and you will see what ancient sailors saw, a vast expanse of water meeting sky in an unbroken line that suggests both infinity and absence, both possibility and emptiness. The sea extends westward without landmarks, without islands to break its surface in this immediate vicinity, without any visible interruption to suggest that anything remarkable ever existed in these particular waters. It is a geography defined by what is not there, no ruins rising from the depths, no columns breaking the surface at low tide, no architectural remnants to mark where a civilization might once have stood, flourished, and fell. Ancient mariners from Phoenicia and Greece, those master sailors who had mapped the Mediterranean with their trading routes and colonial settlements, who had ventured north along the Atlantic coast of Europe and south along the shores of Africa, marked the waters beyond the Pillars of Hercules as dangerous and unrewarding territory. They ventured into the Atlantic. Certainly, Phoenician ships may have circumnavigated Africa centuries before the Common Era. Greek explorers pushed north seeking tin from distant Britain. Intrepid merchants followed currents and winds into unknown waters seeking fortune and glory. But they did not speak of the waters immediately west of the Pillars as particularly promising territory, as a place where great discoveries awaited or where ancient civilizations had left their marks. The ocean there held no great harbors that they knew of, no wealthy cities to trade with, no resources that justified the considerable risks of sailing into the unknown, away from the familiar coastal routes that had sustained Mediterranean commerce for millennia. The sailors who did probe those waters, who pushed beyond the psychological barrier of the Pillars and tested the Atlantic's temperament, described conditions that discouraged further exploration and gave the region a forbidding reputation. They spoke of thick mud, making navigation treacherous and uncertain, of shifting shallows that appeared where their charts and soundings showed deep water should be, of currents that resisted passage and made the sea near the Atlantic boundary unpredictable and hostile to ships built for the calmer waters of the Mediterranean. Whether these accounts reflected actual oceanographic conditions, perhaps the outflow from the Mediterranean creating complex current patterns, perhaps genuine shallow areas near the strait, or served as convenient explanations for turning back from deeper Atlantic voyages. They created and reinforced a reputation. The waters beyond the Pillars were not merely unknown, but actively unwelcoming, a place where the sea itself seemed to warn against intrusion, where nature had placed a boundary that prudent sailors respected. No stone columns broke the surface of these waters, no matter how carefully mariners searched or how clear the water on calm days. No broken walls peaked above the waves at low tide to suggest that structures lay beneath. No submerged foundations were visible in the shallows where fishermen cast their nets, or where divers descended searching for sponges and other marine resources. Fishermen casting nets in these waters found fish, certainly, and occasionally other items lost or thrown overboard from passing ships. But they found no unexpected architecture beneath their boats, no worked stone or carved blocks that might indicate human habitation in ages past. Divers exploring the seafloor for resources encountered rock formations, marine life, the occasional shipwreck from more recent times, but no ancient city, no temple ruins, no evidence of the kind of monumental architecture that would be required for an empire of the scale later descriptions would claim. The archaeological signature was perfectly null, not damaged or weathered or scattered by millennia of time and tide, but simply absent, as though nothing had ever existed there to leave ruins in the first place. The ocean floor in these regions held whatever secrets it held in complete silence, offering no hints to those who sailed above, no anomalies in depth or current that might suggest hidden structures below. The absence of ruins contrasted sharply with legends that would emerge, Legends of an empire said to rival the ancient world in power, sophistication, and extent. The discord between the story and the silence was profound and troubling to those who contemplated it. How could a civilization described as controlling vast territories across the Atlantic and into the Mediterranean, fielding mighty fleets capable of challenging the combined might of Athens and Egypt, building monumental architecture decorated with precious metals and rare stones? How could such an empire vanish so completely that not a single stone testified to its existence? How could power that great leave no trace when lesser civilizations left abundant ruins scattered across the Mediterranean world? The question hung in the air like the sea mist that rolled through the Pillars of Hercules. Unanswerable and persistent, as troubling for what it implied about the reliability of transmitted knowledge as for what it asked about the physical world. This absence of ruins contrasts sharply with legends of an empire said to rival the ancient world, creating a tension that would define the entire mystery for millennia to come. The silence of the Atlantic became, in its own way, the first evidence offered by the Atlantis story, evidence not of presence but of profound absence, not of what was but of what was categorically and completely not, at least not in any form that human observation could detect. And perhaps this is the most haunting form of evidence imaginable. The empty space where something vast is said to have been, the waters that refuse to confirm or deny the stories told about them, the horizon that keeps its secrets beneath waves that have rolled westward for countless ages, indifferent to human curiosity, unmoved by human certainty that something momentous must have happened in these particular waters. The sea does not remember, or perhaps it remembers perfectly and simply has nothing to reveal. Into this silent geography comes writing specifically, the writing of Plato, the Athenian philosopher whose dialogues would become the sole detailed source for everything the world thinks it knows about Atlantis. The narrative introduces Plato's dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, as the only detailed accounts of Atlantis that have survived from antiquity, indeed as the only detailed accounts that seem to have existed even in ancient times. These are not historical documents in the modern sense, not chronicles or annals compiled by witnesses or contemporary observers, but philosophical texts composed in 4th century BCE Athens, works concerned primarily with questions of ethics, governance, and the nature of an ideal society. Yet within these philosophical frameworks, Plato embedded a story that would outlive and overshadow the philosophy it was meant to serve, that would capture imaginations across centuries and continents, that would inspire expeditions and theories and entire libraries of speculation. An account of a lost civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, destroyed by divine punishment after falling into moral corruption and imperial overreach. What makes Plato's account so distinctive, so capable of haunting future generations and resisting dismissal as obvious fiction, is the precision and richness with which he describes Atlantis. This is not a vague legend preserved in fragmentary myths, not a passing reference to a dimly remembered catastrophe, not the kind of bare-bones story that leaves everything to imagination. Plato describes Atlantis with precise geography, political structure, and architectural detail that creates what we might call the reality effect, the accumulation of concrete specifics that makes a narrative feel authentic and grounded in actual observation. He provides geography, an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, positioned in the Atlantic beyond the Pillars of Hercules, surrounded by other islands that create a stepping stone path to a continent on the far side of the ocean. He offers political structure, a confederation of 10 kingdoms ruled by descendants of the god Poseidon and a mortal woman named Plato, each king governing his own territory but meeting periodically to administer justice and coordinate policy according to laws inscribed on pillars of the mysterious metal orichalcum. He details architecture with the specificity of an engineer or surveyor, concentric rings of land and water surrounding a central citadel, with the rings precisely measured and described, elaborate harbors capable of accommodating vast fleets, bridges connecting the rings at measured intervals, temples decorated with gold and silver, and the red glowing orichalcum that was considered precious beyond ordinary metals. He describes the agricultural abundance of the Central Plain, the sophisticated irrigation systems that made it remarkably fertile, the varieties of crops and livestock raised there. He catalogues the military organization, the religious practices centered on bull sacrifice, the gradual moral decline that would lead from virtuous governance to tyrannical corruption and eventual destruction. The account is rich, internally consistent, and presented with the kind of detail that makes readers feel they could almost map Atlantis, almost calculate its dimensions, almost understand its social organization if only it could be found. Yet archaeological records provide no confirmation of Plato's descriptions, no matter how thoroughly researchers have searched or how sophisticated the technologies brought to bear on the question. Modern archaeology, with its refined dating techniques that can place organic materials within years or decades, with its underwater exploration capabilities using sonar and submersibles and remotely operated vehicles, with its global survey of ancient civilizations spanning every continent and ocean, has found precisely nothing that corresponds to Plato's Atlantis in its specifics. No Bronze Age metropolis with concentric harbors arranged in alternating rings of land and water. No widespread trade in orichalcum, that mysterious metal unknown to archaeology. No evidence of a naval empire that controlled territories on both sides of the Atlantic and threatened the entire Mediterranean world. No ruins at any proposed location that match the scale and sophistication Plato describes. The archaeological silence is as complete as the silence of the Atlantic waters themselves, a void that grows more conspicuous and more difficult to explain away the more thoroughly we search, the more sophisticated our methods become. Historians confront the contradiction between narrative richness and physical absence with growing unease and deepening perplexity. How does one treat a story told in such detail, by such an authoritative philosophical source, yet supported by absolutely no independent evidence? If Plato invented Atlantis entirely from imagination, why cloak it in the elaborate language of historical testimony, complete with chains of transmission and claims of Egyptian archival sources? Why provide precise geographic coordinates that place it in real space beyond the real landmark of the Pillars of Hercules? Why include measurements and architectural specifications that serve no obvious philosophical purpose? But if Plato drew on actual historical memory, however distorted through time and transmission, why has no other culture preserved any trace of this supposedly world-shaking civilization? Why does the story appear only in Plato, without parallel versions or supporting evidence from the many other literate cultures around the Mediterranean? The contradiction admits no easy resolution. The story emphasizes that Atlantis appears fully formed in Plato's text, rather than gradually remembered through an accumulating tradition. There is no developmental arc to the Atlantis legend that we can trace through earlier sources. No simpler versions that we can watch evolving into Plato's elaborate account. Before Plato writes in the 4th century BCE, there is silence, no mention in Homer, no reference in Herodotus, no allusion in the tragedians or other poets. After Plato writes, there is Atlantis, complete and detailed, springing into literary existence with all its specifics already in place. This sudden appearance suggests either that Plato had access to a tradition that left absolutely no other written trace despite the Greeks' extensive literary production, or that he created the entire narrative himself as a vehicle for philosophical argument. Both possibilities are troubling in their implications. The first suggests massive gaps in our sources. The second raises questions about why such an elaborate fabrication would be presented as historical truth. Compounding the mystery and frustrating all attempts at interpretive closure, the dialogue Critias ends abruptly, breaking off mid-sentence before Atlantis receives final destruction or the story reaches any philosophical conclusion. We are told that Zeus, observing the moral corruption of the Atlanteans, gathers the gods to pronounce judgment on the fallen civilization, and the text reads, "And Zeus, the god of gods, who rules according to law, perceiving that an honorable race was in a woeful plight, and wanting to inflict punishment on them that they might be chastened and improve, collected all the gods into their most holy habitation, which, being placed in the center of the world, beholds all created things. And when he had called them together, he spake as follows. And there the dialogue stops, cutting off before Zeus's speech, before the description of Atlantis's final moments, before any explicit moral or philosophical conclusion that might clarify what Plato intended readers to take from the story. Scholars question how an empire capable of challenging Athens could vanish without trace, leaving no artifacts, no genetic legacy, no linguistic influence, no architectural techniques borrowed by other cultures. If Atlantis truly threatened the ancient Mediterranean world with its military might, if its fleets sailed against Greece and Egypt as Plato claims, if its influence extended across territories on both sides of the Atlantic, then where are the inevitable traces of its presence that all civilizations leave behind? Where are the trade goods that would have circulated throughout its sphere of influence? The shipwrecks that would have occurred during its naval operations? The cultural exchanges that would have left marks on languages and customs? Where are the survivors or refugees who would have fled the catastrophe and carried their culture to other lands, as survivors of Troy and other destroyed cities did? The absence is not merely in one domain of evidence, but across every category that civilizations typically leave behind: material, linguistic, genetic, cultural. It is an absence so total and comprehensive that it begins to seem less like the erasure of history through natural processes and more like evidence that the history never occurred in the first place. The lack of corroboration from Greek, Phoenician, or Egyptian archaeology deepens uncertainty into something like epistemological vertigo. The Greeks kept extensive records, wrote histories that attempted to document the past systematically, preserved genealogies and myth cycles that referenced countless peoples and places from their world and beyond. The Phoenicians sailed throughout the Atlantic and beyond, establishing colonies and trading posts from Spain to Britain, leaving archaeological signatures wherever they settled. The Egyptians maintained archives spanning millennia, recording foreign peoples, military campaigns, trading partners, and major events with bureaucratic thoroughness. Yet none of these literate, record-keeping civilizations mentions Atlantis, except through Plato's claim that Egyptian priests told Solon, who told someone, who told someone, who eventually told Plato or his sources. The chain of transmission is gossamer thin, unsupported by parallel traditions, resting entirely on Plato's authority as a philosopher. The mystery frames Atlantis as both present in text and absent in the world, a paradoxical existence that defies the normal categories of historical analysis and creates unique methodological challenges. We have words, abundant words, describing Atlantis in vivid detail across several thousand words of Greek text. But we have nothing else, no corroboration from other textual sources, no artifacts that can be definitively linked to Plato's description, no ruins that satisfy the geographic and architectural specifics, no physical evidence of any kind that would allow us to say with confidence, "Here is something from Atlantis. Here is proof that this civilization existed as described." Atlantis exists entirely in language, suspended in the space between what Plato wrote and what the earth refuses to confirm. This makes it unlike almost any other historical question, where we might have fragmentary evidence to debate, contested sources to evaluate, ambiguous archaeological finds to interpret. With Atlantis, we have complete and detailed narrative on one side and complete absence on the other, with no middle ground to negotiate between them, no partial confirmations to build upon. The opening section of our inquiry concludes not with answers, but with a question embedded in silence rather than evidence, a question that will echo through the rest of this exploration. The question is deceptively simple and devastatingly difficult to answer. Did Atlantis vanish beneath the sea, destroyed in a cataclysm so complete and catastrophic that no trace survived the ages, or was Atlantis never meant to be found at all? never intended as history but as something else entirely, a teaching story, a political allegory, a philosophical thought experiment that future generations would mistake for testimony about actual events. The silence of the Atlantic cannot answer this question, for silence can be interpreted in multiple ways as the aftermath of destruction, or as the absence of what never was. The text of Plato cannot answer this question definitively, for it presents itself ambiguously, simultaneously claiming historical truth and serving philosophical purposes. And so we are left suspended between possibilities, contemplating an absence that has become more famous and more debated than most presences, a civilization that may never have existed yet refuses to be forgotten, a mystery that has learned to thrive on what is not there. To understand how Atlantis could emerge and endure as a mystery, to comprehend why Plato's story found fertile ground in which to take root and grow across millennia, we must first understand the world that produced this narrative, a world very different from our own in how it regarded truth, history, memory, and the authority of inherited knowledge. 4th century BC Greece, the crucible in which Plato wrote his dialogues and thought his philosophical thoughts, was a civilization that thrived on debate, literacy, and philosophical inquiry in ways unlike any culture that had come before. The Greek city-states, particularly Athens, had developed sophisticated writing systems, maintained extensive civic records, cultivated libraries and archives, and created a culture where reasoned argument could challenge traditional authority, where logic and rhetoric were taught as essential skills, where the very foundations of knowledge could be questioned and debated in public forums. This was the age of Socrates, the philosopher who had questioned everything and everyone until the city sentenced him to death for corrupting youth and disrespecting the gods. This was the age of the sophists, professional teachers who claimed they could teach virtue and success through the power of argumentation and persuasion. This was the age of democratic assemblies, where rhetoric shaped policy, where citizens voted on matters of war and peace, where the spoken word wielded real political power. It was a world that questioned everything, that took nothing on faith alone, that demanded logical justification for claims and beliefs, yet also a world that trusted certain kinds of stories implicitly, that believed in the authority of ancient wisdom, that accepted testimony from respected sources without demanding the kinds of physical verification we now take for granted. Athens, Plato's city and the center of Greek intellectual life in this period, maintained records with impressive and unusual thoroughness for the ancient world. Genealogies traced descent from mythic heroes, connecting living families to the legendary past through carefully maintained lineages. Civic histories documented wars and treaties and constitutional reforms, preserving memory of political evolution and military campaigns. Inscriptions on stone preserved laws and decrees, honored distinguished citizens, recorded victories and achievements. The Athenians were not indifferent to their past. They cultivated historical memory through both written documents and oral tradition, weaving together documented fact and inherited story into a continuous narrative of Athenian identity and achievement that stretched back through the centuries. Yet this very sophistication in record-keeping coexisted with, and perhaps even reinforced, a belief that much of the distant past remained fundamentally undocumented or lost to living memory. The Greeks knew their writing system was relatively recent in historical terms, adopted from the Phoenicians only a few centuries earlier, and that earlier Greek civilizations had used writing systems, linear A and B, that were no longer understood even in Plato's time. They understood that oral traditions stretched back beyond written records, that great events might have occurred in ages before anyone thought to inscribe them permanently in stone or preserve them on perishable papyrus. This awareness created a sense that the documented past was merely the visible tip of a much larger historical iceberg, that undocumented ages of human experience preceded the written record, and that claims about the distant past could not be easily verified or falsified through the available sources. Egyptian civilization commanded enormous respect throughout the Greek world as an ancient source of wisdom, stability, and continuity. Where Greek history could trace itself back perhaps 1,000 years with any real confidence. Where Greek cities were relatively recent foundations compared to the great antiquity claimed by other cultures, Egypt presented an image of timeless permanence. Egypt claimed a past stretching back not merely centuries but thousands upon thousands of years, recorded in hieroglyphic inscriptions that the Greeks could not read but deeply admired and respected. Egypt's monuments, the pyramids above all, but also the massive temples and statues that lined the Nile testified to achievements that the Greeks could admire but not match, to a civilization that had already been ancient when Greek culture was just beginning to form. Greek thinkers viewed Egypt as a repository of deep historical memory, a civilization that had survived long enough and maintained records carefully enough to remember events that other cultures had forgotten. This perception made Egypt an appealing source for claims about ancient knowledge, for stories that supposedly reached back into the depths of time. If you wanted to ground a narrative in the most distant past, claiming Egyptian origin gave it immediate gravitas and authority. The Egyptian priesthood was imagined, whether accurately or not, as custodians of wisdom stretching back through dynasties upon dynasties, through catastrophes and renewals, through cycles of rise and fall that dwarfed the Greek historical horizon. Whether this reputation was entirely deserved matters less than the fact that Greeks believed it, and this belief shaped how they received stories claimed to originate in Egyptian temples and archives. The Mediterranean world of this era was defined by trade, memory, and oral tradition that connected diverse cultures through complex networks of exchange. Trade routes crisscrossed the sea, linking Greece to Egypt, Phoenicia, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Spain, and beyond. Ships carried not just wine and olive oil and pottery and metalwork, but also stories, legends, accounts of distant lands and strange peoples. Sailors returning from Atlantic voyages brought reports of islands and ocean conditions and encounters with foreign tribes. Merchants who had traveled to distant ports shared tales of what they had seen and heard. This oral exchange meant that Greek intellectuals had access to a vast fund of stories and claims about the wider world, some accurate, some exaggerated, some entirely fabricated, and few with any reliable way to verify them beyond assessing their plausibility and coherence with other known facts. Into this rich and complex intellectual environment came Plato, one of the most influential philosophers in human history, a man whose thinking would shape Western civilization for millennia after his death. But Plato emerges in our story not as a dispassionate observer or a historian in the modern sense. He was neither interested in nor trained for the kind of source criticism and documentary verification that modern historical methods demand. Plato was a philosopher concerned with ethics, governance, and ideal societies, with questions about justice and virtue, with the relationship between the individual soul and the political state. He was a teacher who founded the Academy, one of the first institutions of higher learning in the Western tradition, where generations of Athenian intellectuals studied mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and dialectical reasoning. Plato taught within the Academy, shaping how his students thought about fundamental questions of existence, knowledge, and morality. His philosophical method involved using stories, analogies, myths, and thought experiments to illuminate abstract principles and make philosophical arguments vivid and memorable. The allegory of the cave, in which prisoners mistake shadows for reality, illustrates epistemological arguments about the nature of knowledge and appearance. The myth of describing the soul's journey after death, serves to reinforce arguments about justice and the immortality of the soul. The Ring of Gyges, a thought experiment about a ring that makes its wearer invisible, explores whether people are just because of virtue or merely because of social constraints. These are teaching tools, narratives designed to make philosophical points accessible and compelling, and Plato's audience would have understood them as such. Within Plato's narrative about Atlantis, Solon appears as a crucial link in the chain of transmission. Solon was a respected lawgiver and statesman, one of the 7 sages of Greece, a historical figure who had lived about 2 centuries before Plato and whose reputation for wisdom and integrity remained unquestioned. According to Plato's account, Solon traveled to Egypt during a diplomatic mission, visiting the temple of Neith at Sais in the Nile Delta, and there conversed with priests who had access to ancient records far older than anything preserved in Greece. This framing is crucial to how the story functions. Plato does not claim to have invented the Atlantis narrative, nor does he present it as an acknowledged philosophical fiction that his audience should understand as illustrative rather than historical. Instead, he grounds it in testimony, in a chain of transmission from authoritative sources stretching back through generations. Plato presents Solon as traveling to Egypt during a diplomatic mission, seeking to learn from Egyptian wisdom and bringing back knowledge to enrich Athens. The Egyptian priests at Sais, as Plato presents them through multiple layers of narration, serve as custodians of ancient records that supposedly preserve events from 9,000 years before Solon's time, a chronology that would place Atlantis in the depths of prehistory, long before any civilization known to archaeology in Plato's region. These priests, in Plato's account, criticize Greek ignorance of deep history, pointing out that Greece has suffered periodic catastrophes, floods, earthquakes, fires that destroyed written records and reduced survivors to beginning again like children in their understanding of the past, losing the accumulated knowledge of previous ages. The Egyptian priests criticize Greek ignorance of deep history, contrasting Greek forgetfulness with Egyptian memory. According to this narrative framework, Egypt has been protected by the Nile's annual floods from the worst devastations that have periodically reset other civilizations, allowing it to maintain continuous records spanning epochs while other cultures repeatedly forgot their own pasts. The priests thus position themselves as having access to a historical horizon far deeper than anything available to Greek inquiry, and crucially, to a past that the Greeks cannot independently verify, since their own records don't reach back far enough to confirm or contradict Egyptian claims about events 9,000 years before Solon. According to the story Plato tells through Solon's testimony, Athens itself appears as an idealized society in ancient times, not the imperial democracy of Plato's own era with its failures and excesses, but a city ruled by wise guardians, embodying principles of justice and military courage, defending freedom against tyranny. This ancient Athens supposedly defeated the Atlantean invasion 9,000 years before, saving the Mediterranean world from subjugation and preserving Greek independence against an overwhelming foreign power. The priests present this Athenian victory as historical fact preserved in their temple archives, but forgotten by the Greeks themselves due to subsequent catastrophes that wiped out their written memory and reduced their knowledge of the distant past. Plato contrasts idealized ancient Athens with imperial Athens of the Peloponnesian War era, the Athens that had overreached its proper bounds, fallen into demagoguery and tyranny, and ultimately been defeated by Sparta after decades of destructive warfare. The comparison is pointed and deliberate, serving obvious philosophical purposes. The Athens that appears in the Atlantis story represents everything Plato wishes his own Athens could be: disciplined, virtuous, protective of freedom, guided by wisdom rather than by appetite or ambition. By placing this idealized Athens in the distant past, Plato creates both a golden age to aspire toward and an implicit criticism of contemporary Athenian failures. The philosophical purpose is transparent, but does this philosophical purpose necessarily mean the historical framing is merely rhetorical window dressing? Greek audiences of Plato's time accepted that much of the distant past was undocumented or forgotten, that their own historical knowledge was fragmentary and incomplete. They believed that earlier civilizations might have risen and fallen, leaving only faint traces or oral memories. that natural catastrophes could erase whole eras of achievement, that the documented past represented only a small fraction of actual human experience. This worldview made Plato's story more inherently plausible than it might seem to modern ears accustomed to skepticism about ancient testimony. The idea that a great civilization could vanish completely didn't require special pleading or elaborate justification in a cultural context that already accepted cyclical catastrophes and lost golden ages as facts of history. Natural disasters such as floods and earthquakes were viewed as cyclical events that periodically reset human civilization, destroying cities and killing populations and disrupting the continuity of cultural memory. The Greeks lived in a geologically active region where earthquakes could destroy cities in moments, where volcanic eruptions could devastate entire islands, where floods could wash away coastal settlements. They had myths of great floods, Deucalion's flood, that drowned the ancient world, for instance, suggesting that catastrophic inundations were part of their ancestral memory. They understood viscerally that natural forces could overwhelm human achievement, that the works of civilization were fragile against the power of earth and sea. The notion that such forces could destroy even a powerful empire like Atlantis was not merely plausible, but almost expected, fitting into established patterns of thought about how the world worked. Moral decay was believed to precede divine punishment across Greek culture, creating a causal framework where Atlantis's corruption would naturally and inevitably lead to its destruction. The gods rewarded virtue and punished hybris, arrogance, overreach, the kind of pride that forgets proper limits. This was foundational to Greek ethical and theological thought, reinforced by countless myths and tragedies. A civilization that began in justice and piety but gradually declined into tyranny and greed would inevitably face divine retribution. The gods would not allow such corruption to continue indefinitely. The moral order of the cosmos demanded punishment. This sequence was so familiar from Greek mythology and moral teaching that Plato didn't need to argue for it extensively. He could simply assert it, and his audience would recognize the pattern and accept its logic as self-evident. Philosophical narratives were expected to convey truth in ancient Greece, even if not literal fact in every concrete detail. This is perhaps the most important piece of context for understanding how Plato's audience might have received and interpreted the Atlantis story. Greek philosophers used myths, allegories, and illustrative tales constantly as teaching tools. But these stories were understood to convey truth, moral truth, philosophical truth, truth about human nature and divine justice and the structure of reality. The question wasn't necessarily whether a philosophical story was true in our modern sense of being factually accurate in all its details, but whether it was true in the deeper sense of revealing something essential and important about reality, ethics, politics, or the human condition. Oral transmission remained vulnerable to embellishment and compression, and the Greeks knew this even as they relied on oral tradition to preserve much of their cultural memory. Stories passed down through generations inevitably changed, acquiring new details, losing old ones, compressing chronologies, conflating separate events. The chain of transmission Plato describes from Egyptian priests to Solon, to Solon's relatives to Critias, the elder to Critias, the younger who tells the story in Plato's dialogue spans over 2 centuries and crosses from one culture and language to another. At each link in this chain, the story could have changed, been misunderstood, been embellished, or had details added or subtracted. The very length and complexity of the transmission chain raises questions about reliability that Plato's text does not directly address. The authority of ancient knowledge in Plato's world was rarely questioned in the systematic way that modern scholarship questions sources. If Egyptian priests said something happened 9,000 years ago, on what basis would a Greek philosopher challenge that claim? The Greeks had no method for scientifically dating events in the deep past, no archaeological techniques for verifying ancient timelines, no independent access to Egyptian records that would allow them to check Egyptian testimony. They could only evaluate such claims based on internal consistency. plausibility given what they knew about the world, and the authority of the source making the claim. This created an intellectual environment where old testimony carried great weight, where claims about the distant past were difficult to verify but also difficult to dismiss, where the burden of proof fell less heavily on those making extraordinary claims about antiquity. This intellectual world trusted inherited stories more than physical verification, operated with different epistemological standards than we now use. The Greeks were sophisticated thinkers who valued logical argumentation and empirical observation in many domains, but they also accepted that much about the past, about the gods, about the nature of reality beyond immediate experience, had to be taken on authority and tradition rather than verified through direct investigation. This wasn't intellectual laziness or credulity, it was a reasonable response to the limitations of their investigative methods and the nature of the questions they grappled with. In this context, Plato's Atlantis story could find acceptance not despite its lack of physical evidence, but because physical evidence wasn't the primary criterion by which such stories were judged. This world that produced the mystery was sophisticated enough to create detailed philosophical narratives that explored complex ethical and political questions, credulous enough to accept claims about the deep past without demanding the kinds of verification we now expect, and troubled enough by contemporary political failures to find stories about corrupted empires receiving divine punishment both plausible and morally relevant. In this context, Plato wrote his dialogues, embedded his Atlantis narrative within them, and set in motion a mystery that would outlive the civilization that created it, that would survive the fall of Athens and Rome and all the ancient world, that would find new life in each successive age that rediscovered Plato's words and wondered whether the philosopher had recorded history or crafted the most successful fictional narrative in human history. The critical moment in Atlantis's strange transformation from philosophical illustration to historical obsession occurs when Plato introduces the lost civilization, not as acknowledged fiction, not as transparent allegory whose invented nature would be obvious to readers, but as historical fact within the philosophical dialogue Timaeus. The framing is crucial, deliberate, and consequential. The dialogue begins with Socrates recalling a previous discussion about the ideal state, a reference to Plato's Republic, and expressing a desire to see this ideal state in action rather than merely described in abstract theory. In response, Critias, a character based on Plato's own relative, offers to tell a story which, though strange, is certainly true. A tale about ancient Athens that supposedly demonstrates the ideal state actually existing and defending civilization against foreign aggression. Plato frames the Atlantis account as inherited knowledge rather than invention, as testimony passed down through generations rather than philosophical speculation created for illustrative purposes. This framing changes everything about how the story functions and how it would be received. Critias claims to have heard the story from his grandfather, also named Critias, who heard it from his own father Dropides, who heard it from Solon himself, who heard it from Egyptian priests during his visit to Sais. Each link in this chain of transmission carries authority. Solon was one of Athens's most respected lawgivers, a man of unquestioned integrity whose word would be trusted implicitly. The Egyptian priests represented an ancient civilization whose historical depth the Greeks acknowledged, and whose claims about the past were difficult to challenge given Greek limitations in accessing or verifying Egyptian records. Atlantis is positioned beyond the Pillars of Hercules, outside familiar geography, but not beyond the edges of the known world or in some mythical realm impossible to locate in real space. The Atlantic Ocean was real, a documented geographical feature that Greek and Phoenician sailors had explored to various extents. The Pillars of Hercules were a recognized landmark, the boundary between the inner sea of the Mediterranean and the outer ocean. By placing Atlantis in actual geography rather than in mythic space like Olympus or the underworld, Plato grounds his story in the physical world, in a specific location that could theoretically be reached by ship if one knew where to sail and had the courage to venture into the open Atlantic. This geographic specificity invites literal interpretation in ways that placing Atlantis in obviously mythical space would not. Plato describes Atlantis as wealthy, technologically advanced, and politically organized with a level of detail that seems unnecessary if the goal is merely philosophical illustration. He provides measurements. The central plain is 3,000 by 2,000 stadia in dimensions, an area roughly equivalent to modern-day Portugal. He describes the concentric circles of water and land surrounding the citadel, giving their exact widths. The outer ring of water is 3 stadia wide, the next ring of land is 2 stadia, and so on in alternating rings, each with precise measurements. He explains the engineering, bridges connecting the rings at carefully specified intervals, tunnels allowing ships to pass from the outer ocean through the rings to the inner harbor, a channel cut through the rings of land to allow this passage. He catalogues resources and materials with the thoroughness of an economic survey. The island produces abundant gold, silver, copper, and tin, all the metals needed for a Bronze Age civilization. It also produces orichalcum, a mysterious metal that glows with reddish light and is considered precious, surpassed in value only by gold, a detail that adds exotic flavor but also raises questions, since no such metal is known to archaeology. He describes agricultural abundance. The island grows all manner of crops, supports large herds of elephants, a detail that has led some theorists to propose African or Asian locations, and produces exotic fruits and medicinal plants. The flora and fauna are catalogued as though Plato is describing a real ecosystem rather than an imaginary island. The Atlantean Empire challenges ancient Athens in military conflict according to Plato's narrative, creating historical drama that supposedly places Mediterranean civilization at mortal risk. Atlantis has extended its power not only throughout the Atlantic region, but also across North Africa as far as Egypt and into Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, roughly the area of modern Italy. This imperial expansion brings Atlantis into conflict with Athens and other free Greek states. The resulting war is presented as genuinely historical, with Athens standing as defender of Greek freedom against foreign imperialism, succeeding where other states failed or submitted, ultimately defeating the Atlantean forces through military virtue and tactical superiority, despite being greatly outnumbered. But Atlantis functions as more than just a historical antagonist in Plato's narrative. It serves as a moral mirror reflecting the dangers of unchecked power and corruption, illustrating in narrative form the philosophical arguments about justice, virtue, and political decline that concerned Plato deeply. He describes how Atlantis began as a just and prosperous society, blessed by the gods, ordered according to divine wisdom as transmitted through Poseidon's laws. The original Atlanteans were virtuous, moderate in their appetites, valuing wisdom and virtue over wealth and power. But over many generations, the divine element in the Atlantean rulers became diluted through repeated mixture with mortal nature. Human weaknesses asserted themselves. The Atlanteans grew ambitious, greedy, imperialistic, pursuing wealth and power for their own sake rather than as means to virtue and the good life. This moral decline follows a pattern familiar from Greek political theory and ethical thought: hybris, leading inevitably to nemesis, arrogance producing its own punishment. The Atlanteans begin to appear unseemly to those who can perceive true values, though to those unable to perceive what truly constitutes happiness, they seem at the height of their power and prosperity even as they are actually falling into corruption. This is classic Platonic philosophy, the gap between appearance and reality, between what the masses perceive as success and what the wise understand as decline. The story demonstrates in narrative form what Plato argues philosophically, that moral corruption precedes and causes political collapse, that empires fall not primarily through external enemies but through internal decay. Divine punishment follows Atlantean moral decay in Plato's narrative, providing both theological and natural explanations for the civilization's destruction. Zeus, observing the corruption of the Atlanteans, decides to punish them to make them humble and virtuous again, to teach through suffering what they have forgotten in prosperity. He gathers all the gods to their most holy habitation to pronounce judgment, and here, frustratingly, the text of Critias breaks off. We never learn what Zeus says, never witness the actual destruction, never receive explicit confirmation of how the divine judgment manifests in physical catastrophe. What we know from the earlier dialogue Timaeus is that earthquakes and floods destroy Atlantis in a single day and night, that the island sinks beneath the sea, that the destruction is so complete that afterward the ocean becomes impassable due to shoals of mud. Plato presents the destruction as sudden and total, with no survivors, no refugees, no remnant population carrying Atlantean culture to other lands. This completeness of destruction serves multiple narrative functions. It explains why no physical evidence remains. It demonstrates the power of divine punishment. It creates a neat moral conclusion where corruption receives its full consequences without reprieve. But it also creates interpretive problems for those who want to read Atlantis as history. Because such total destruction is geologically and archaeologically difficult to support. How does an entire island larger than Libya and Asia sink beneath the sea in a single day without leaving massive geological signatures? How do all inhabitants perish without some managing to escape by ship? The very totality that makes the moral tale satisfying makes the historical claim implausible. The dialogue Critias breaks off before concluding the story, ending mid-sentence as Zeus is about to speak, denying readers the closure that might have revealed Plato's intent more clearly. This incomplete ending has fueled speculation for over 2 millennia. Why did Plato stop writing at this crucial moment? Was he interrupted by death before completing the dialogue? Did he decide the story was making points he no longer wanted to make? Was there a complete version that has been lost? Or did he deliberately leave the story unfinished, creating an open question rather than a closed narrative, inviting readers to contemplate rather than to receive definitive answers? We don't know. And this uncertainty means we can never be entirely certain how Plato intended the Atlantis narrative to function or be interpreted. The incomplete ending denies readers interpretive closure, transforms what might have been a complete philosophical illustration into a puzzle without a clear solution. If the dialogue had continued, if we had Zeus's speech and a full description of the destruction, and perhaps some explicit philosophical moralizing about what the story demonstrates, we might understand Plato's intent more clearly. Instead, we have a fragment that raises questions it doesn't answer, that provides enormous detail but no explicit interpretive framework, that can be read as history or allegory, or something in between without the text itself settling the question definitively. Ancient readers treat Atlantis as plausible history rather than transparent metaphor. At least some of them, though we have limited evidence for how Plato's contemporary audience initially received the story. Aristotle, Plato's most famous student and intellectual rival, reportedly dismissed Atlantis with the comment that Plato invented the island and then made it disappear. But even this dismissal treats Atlantis as a historical claim that can be disputed rather than as acknowledged fiction that needs no refutation. Later, ancient writers like Crantor, Proclus, and Plutarch discuss Atlantis as a historical question, debating whether Plato's account represents actual events or philosophical invention, treating it as an open question requiring argument rather than as an obviously fictional teaching story. Plato's authority shields the story from contemporary challenge and ensures its preservation and transmission. Plato was not just any writer, but one of antiquity's most respected philosophers, founder of the Academy, student of Socrates, teacher of Aristotle. His works became central to philosophical education, were copied carefully, studied intensely, commented upon extensively. When a figure of such intellectual stature presents a story as historical truth, even if embedded in philosophical dialogue, Dismissing it requires explaining why Plato would lie or be gravely mistaken, and few ancient or medieval readers were willing to accuse Plato of either dishonesty or such spectacular error. No surviving ancient text disputes Plato's account directly with alternative sources or contradictory evidence. The Greeks had historians like Herodotus and Thucydides who traveled, interviewed witnesses, compiled accounts of peoples and places, attempted to separate truth from legend, but none of them mentions Atlantis, either to confirm or deny it. Egyptian records that survive into the present make no reference to the events or civilization Plato describes. This silence is telling, but in antiquity it wasn't necessarily damning. The past was vast. Record-keeping was incomplete even in literate civilizations. Many accounts had been lost to time and disaster. The absence of corroboration didn't prove falsity. It might mean that knowledge had been lost, as Plato's own narrative suggests happened repeatedly through cyclical catastrophes. Atlantis becomes embedded in philosophical discussion across generations, transmitted not as fringe speculation but as part of the Platonic corpus, preserved alongside more obviously philosophical dialogues about justice, knowledge, and the forms. Students reading Plato's works encounter Atlantis as part of their education, and while they may debate its historicity, they cannot ignore it. The story becomes canonical through its association with an author too important to forget, too central to philosophical education to exclude from reading lists. Whether readers believe Atlantis was real or not, they must grapple with the story as part of engaging seriously with Plato's thought. A moral lesson about corruption and divine justice begins to harden into geographic curiosity about a lost civilization, a subtle transformation in how the story functions across generations. What Plato may have intended as philosophical illustration, a cautionary tale about the inevitable corruption of power, a demonstration of how moral decay brings destruction, starts to be read as a historical mystery with a potential solution in physical geography. If Atlantis existed, where was it? If it was destroyed, could ruins remain? If it sank beneath the sea, might it someday be found? These questions shift attention from the story's meaning to its potential factual basis, from ethics to archaeology, from philosophy to exploration. This transformation from philosophical parable to historical puzzle represents the critical turning point in Atlantis's strange afterlife across the centuries. A story that might have been understood as the myth of or the allegory of the cave were understood as obviously constructed narratives deployed to make philosophical points, instead becomes a question that demands geographic and historical investigation. The detail Plato provided, meant perhaps to make the moral lesson vivid and memorable, becomes a map that explorers will try to follow for the next 2,000 years. The authority Plato commanded, meant to ensure readers took his ethical arguments seriously, becomes evidence that the story itself must contain historical truth. And the text cannot settle this question because the text itself is fundamentally ambiguous, simultaneously presenting Atlantis as historical fact and deploying it for philosophical purposes, framing it as inherited testimony while using it as moral illustration. Centuries pass without physical evidence of Atlantis emerging from the earth or sea. And this absence, rather than gradually diminishing belief or settling the question towards skepticism, somehow deepens the mystery and multiplies interpretations. In a straightforwardly rational world, the complete failure over many centuries to find any archaeological confirmation of Plato's story would erode belief in Atlantis's historicity until it was understood by consensus as philosophical fiction, or at most a distorted memory of some much smaller historical event. But Atlantis proves remarkably immune to such rational erosion. Each generation that searches and fails to find simply makes room for the next generation to search differently, to look in new places with new technologies, to propose novel theories about what kind of civilization Atlantis might have been, or where its ruins might lie hidden. The absence of evidence becomes not a reason to conclude Atlantis never existed, but rather a challenge to search more cleverly, to think more imaginatively about the various ways a civilization could vanish or where its traces might be concealed. Medieval scholars preserve Plato's texts without seriously questioning Atlantis's historicity, accepting the story as part of the inherited wisdom of classical antiquity that deserved preservation and study. During the Middle Ages, when Greek philosophical texts were preserved primarily in Arabic translations before being reintroduced to Western Europe through Islamic Spain and other contact points, Plato's dialogues retained their authority as masterpieces of philosophical thought. The scholars who painstakingly copied these texts, who translated them between languages, who wrote commentaries attempting to understand and explain Plato's arguments, generally took Plato at his word about Atlantis. If the great philosopher said Egyptian priests had told Solon about this vanished civilization, who were medieval copyists to dispute it, the story was preserved not as acknowledged mythology or obvious fiction, but as ancient testimony, whatever its ultimate truth value might prove to be upon further investigation. Renaissance thinkers reinterpret Atlantis through new lenses of cartography and exploration as Europeans begin their great age of oceanic voyaging and geographic discovery. This reinterpretation dramatically and permanently expands the story's geographic possibilities in ways that ensure it will never be conclusively disproven. The Age of Discovery revolutionizes European understanding of world geography. At a fundamental level, the Atlantic Ocean, which had been a largely unknown western boundary beyond which lay only speculation and sailors' tales, becomes a traversable space leading to entire continents whose existence was unknown to ancient Greeks. Columbus reaches the Caribbean. Magellan's expedition circumnavigates the globe. Gradually, Europeans map the Americas, the Pacific, the true extent of Africa and Asia. Suddenly the question, where was Atlantis, has vastly more potential answers than it had when the Atlantic was barely explored, and the only known lands were those surrounding the Mediterranean and extending eastward into Asia. If there were entire continents in the Atlantic or beyond it in the Pacific that Plato's world didn't know existed, might one of them be Atlantean? Might the Americas themselves be remnants of Atlantean civilization, survivors of some cataclysm that destroyed the mother island? Might there be other unknown lands where Atlantean refugees settled? The expansion of geographical knowledge paradoxically makes Atlantis more difficult to dismiss rather than easier, because there are now so many more places it could theoretically have been. Proposed locations for Atlantis expand far beyond the Mediterranean world, as each new geographic discovery suggests new possibilities to imaginative theorists. The list of proposed Atlantis sites eventually grows to encompass nearly every ocean and several continents, a proliferation that might seem to weaken the Atlantis hypothesis if it could be anywhere. Perhaps it was nowhere, but instead keeps the mystery alive by ensuring that no single negative result can falsify all possible locations simultaneously. Atlantis becomes a moving target, always potentially located one ocean away from the last failed search, always plausibly hidden in the one region that hasn't yet been thoroughly explored. Crete is suggested as a Bronze Age precursor to Atlantis after archaeological discoveries reveal the sophisticated Minoan civilization. The excavation of Knossos and other Minoan sites in the early 20th century reveals a culture that was remarkably advanced for its time, with elaborate palace complexes, sophisticated art, extensive trade networks, and advanced engineering, including indoor plumbing. The Minoan civilization collapsed suddenly around 1500 BCE, roughly contemporaneous with the catastrophic eruption of Thera, modern Santorini. The parallels to Plato's story are tantalizing. An advanced island civilization destroyed by natural catastrophe, leaving ruins that modern archaeology can study. The theory suggests that Plato or his Egyptian sources, or earlier Greek sources, preserved a garbled memory of Minoan collapse, adding zeros to timescales and embellishing details, but retaining a core of historical truth about a real civilization's destruction. Santorini itself is proposed as a volcanic parallel to Plato's catastrophe. and this theory has gained considerable support among those seeking a historical kernel within Plato's narrative. The volcanic island of Thera exploded in one of the largest eruptions in recorded history, creating tsunamis that devastated coastal settlements throughout the eastern Mediterranean and potentially contributing to the decline of Minoan civilization on Crete. The image of an island civilization destroyed in a single day by volcanic fire and seismic devastation closely matches Plato's description of Atlantis' sudden end. Archaeological excavations at Akrotiri on Santorini reveal a Bronze Age city preserved in volcanic ash, a Mediterranean Pompeii that demonstrates the reality of sudden urban destruction through volcanic catastrophe. But problems arise immediately when attempting to map Santorini onto Plato's Atlantis with any precision. The chronology is wrong by an order of magnitude. Plato places Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon, roughly 9,600 BCE. But Thera erupted around 1,600 BCE, only about 900 years before Plato's time. Could Egyptian priests or Greek transmitters have added a zero, turning 900 years into 9,000? Perhaps, but this is speculative. The geography is fundamentally wrong. Santorini is located inside the Mediterranean, in the Aegean Sea, not beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean, as Plato explicitly states. The scale is wrong. Santorini is a small island, while Plato describes Atlantis as larger than Libya and Asia combined. To make Santorini fit Atlantis requires assuming Plato got almost every concrete detail wrong while somehow preserving an abstract memory of volcanic destruction, a theory that explains one aspect while discarding most others. Spain is identified with ancient Tartessos as a possible Atlantean remnant or inspiration, and this theory has the advantage of correct general location. Tartessos, mentioned in ancient sources as a wealthy trading kingdom near the Pillars of Hercules, controlled the metal trade between the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Ancient texts describe Tartessos as extraordinarily rich in silver and other metals, dominating commerce in the region before mysteriously declining or disappearing sometime in the 6th century BCE. The civilization's archaeological remains are limited but suggestive, indicating a culture wealthy enough and sophisticated enough to have inspired legends. The location is approximately right near the Pillars of Hercules, as Plato specified, and the association with metal wealth matches Plato's descriptions. Yet Tartessos doesn't fit Plato's description any better than Santorini does when examined in detail. It was a coastal trading kingdom, not an island empire with concentric ring harbors. There's no evidence it controlled vast Atlantic territories or threatened Athens militarily. The two civilizations existed in different periods and different spheres of influence. The chronology is closer than Santorini, but still doesn't match Plato's 9,000-year timeline. Most problematically, Tartessos didn't sink beneath the sea in a cataclysmic event. It simply declined as a political and economic power, possibly due to Carthaginian competition, changing trade routes, or resource depletion. If Atlantis is merely a memory of Tartessos, we must explain away the sinking, the catastrophic destruction, the concentric harbors, and nearly all the specific architectural and geographic details that make Plato's account distinctive. Antarctica enters speculation following fringe theories about polar shifts and ancient ice-free periods, theories that venture far from mainstream geology into speculative territory. The idea is that Atlantis might have been located in Antarctica during some hypothetical period when that continent was not covered in ice, and that subsequent climate change or crustal displacement moved it to its current polar position while burying it under ice sheets miles thick. This theory has the advantage of being almost completely unfalsifiable. Any absence of surface evidence can be explained by saying it's buried under ice that is prohibitively difficult and expensive to excavate beneath. It requires accepting controversial geology and Earth crust displacement theories that lack support from mainstream science. But for believers, this is a feature rather than a bug, evidence that mainstream science refuses to consider revolutionary possibilities. The Americas are proposed as Atlantean territories after European contact expands geographic imagination beyond the Mediterranean world's horizons. Some theories suggest that Plato's Atlantis was actually an ancient American civilization, perhaps Olmec, perhaps Maya, perhaps some earlier culture whose achievements were reported to Mediterranean travelers through some chain of contact and eventually reached Plato in distorted form. Other theories propose that Atlantis was a mid-Atlantic island or landmass that served as a bridge between Old World and New, allowing cultural exchange that would explain perceived similarities between ancient Mediterranean and American civilizations, similarities that mainstream archaeology explains through independent invention rather than direct contact. These theories multiply explanatory hypotheses to preserve Atlantis's existence, even as geographic knowledge expands to show that no such bridge continent exists in the Atlantic. Geological sciences introduced tsunamis and plate tectonics as explanatory tools, providing natural mechanisms by which islands could sink or civilizations be destroyed. The discovery that the ocean floor is not permanent but constantly being created at mid-ocean ridges and consumed at subduction zones creates theoretical space for islands to have existed in the Atlantic and then been removed from the surface through geological processes. Tsunami science explains how coastal civilizations can be devastated in hours by wave trains generated by distant earthquakes or underwater landslides, lending plausibility to the idea of sudden destruction by flood. These scientific advances make Plato's story of catastrophic destruction seem less implausible from a physical standpoint, even as they provide no positive evidence that it actually occurred as described. Yet no candidate location satisfies Plato's geography, scale, and chronology simultaneously. This remains the fundamental and unsolvable problem that has frustrated Atlantis seekers for over 2 millennia. Every proposed site requires discarding or radically reinterpreting major elements of Plato's account. If we privilege the Atlantic location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, we must abandon the Bronze Age chronology that Minoan and Thera theories suggest. If we accept the volcanic catastrophe parallel, we must ignore the geographic coordinates Plato provides. If we take the 9,000-year timeline seriously, we enter prehistory, where no civilization matching Plato's description is known from archaeology. The details that make Atlantis specific and memorable, the geographic location, the architectural description, the timeline, the political structure are precisely the details that make it impossible to identify with any known historical event or place with confidence. Archaeological expeditions yield ambiguous or disappointing results when they venture forth seeking Atlantis, often finding interesting sites that advance general archaeological knowledge but don't confirm Plato's specific claims. Underwater archaeology discovers submerged cities and ports along Mediterranean coastlines, but these are ordinary ancient settlements drowned by sea level rise or seismic subsidence, not the vast metropolis Plato describes. Geological surveys map the Atlantic seafloor with increasing precision, but they find no evidence of a sunken continent, only the normal features of seafloor spreading and oceanic crust formation. Remote sensing occasionally detects unusual underwater formations, but upon investigation they turn out to be natural geological features rather than artificial structures, volcanic formations rather than architectural ruins. Researchers face professional consequences when speculative claims about Atlantis prove unsupported or when their enthusiasm for the mystery leads them to interpret ambiguous evidence too favorably. Archaeologists and geologists who pursue Atlantis too publicly or enthusiastically risk their reputations in scholarly communities, where Atlantis is generally regarded as a philosophical thought experiment rather than a viable archaeological project. The boundary between serious scholarship and fringe speculation becomes contested territory, with some researchers believing that dismissing Atlantis categorically represents unscientific dogmatism, while others argue that pursuing Atlantis wastes resources better spent on documented civilizations and demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how philosophy and allegory worked in ancient texts. Academic communities divide between skeptics and literalists, though these labels oversimplify what is actually a spectrum of positions. The skeptics, who hold dominant positions in mainstream archaeology and classics, argue that Plato's story is transparently allegorical, that no amount of geographic speculation can turn philosophy into history, that the absence of any corroborating evidence after 2,000 years of searching is decisive. The literalists, often working outside traditional academic institutions or in amateur capacities, argue that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that ancient testimony should be taken seriously until definitively disproven, that mainstream archaeology's dismissal of Atlantis reflects bias and closed-mindedness rather than reasoned evaluation of evidence. Between these poles lie various intermediate positions, scholars who see possible historical kernels distorted by transmission, researchers open to investigating specific claims while remaining agnostic about the larger question. Atlantis gains power through unresolved possibility rather than through confirmation or even through promising leads. This is perhaps the most paradoxical and revealing aspect of the Atlantis phenomenon. The mystery becomes more compelling, not less, as evidence continues to fail to emerge. Each failed expedition doesn't diminish belief or interest, but rather demonstrates that Atlantis is still out there somewhere, waiting to be found by the right search in the right place with the right interpretation. The story's power lies precisely in its unfalsifiability. You can always propose a new location, a new theory, a new explanation for why previous searches failed. Atlantis thrives in the gaps of our knowledge, in the places we haven't yet searched thoroughly, in the interpretive ambiguities that allow multiple readings of Plato's text. Absence of evidence becomes central to the narrative rather than disqualifying, transformed from a weakness into a kind of perverse strength. Where most historical questions lose interest when evidence consistently fails to appear, Atlantis transforms that absence into mystery and fuel for speculation. The empty ocean floor doesn't prove Atlantis never existed. It proves how thoroughly it was destroyed, how complete the cataclysm was. The lack of corroborating texts doesn't disprove the story, it demonstrates how much ancient knowledge was lost. Every void in our historical and archaeological record becomes potential space for Atlantis to hide. The story has evolved to feed on absence, to grow stronger in the face of what isn't found, rather than weaker. Atlantis shifts from historical claims subject to empirical verification to interpretive battlefield, where debates are less about facts than about methodology, hermeneutics, and epistemology. The question, did Atlantis exist, becomes inseparable from questions about how we read ancient texts. How literally should we take Plato's geographic and chronological specifics? What counts as allegory and what as testimony? When philosophical narratives include concrete details, are those details meaningful or ornamental? How much credence should we give to ancient sources when they make extraordinary claims? These methodological questions ensure that Atlantis remains relevant and debated regardless of archaeological results, because the core dispute is no longer primarily about finding ruins but about how we interpret absence, assess authority, and navigate the boundary between philosophy and history. History does not collapse into certainty, as we might rationally hope it would after millennia of investigation and technological advancement. Instead, it dissolves into possibility, becoming a landscape of competing theories, where no single answer commands universal assent, where every interpretation explains some evidence while struggling with other aspects. The compounding consequences of Plato's story are not resolution but proliferation, not the triumph of truth over falsehood, but the multiplication of interpretations, each plausible enough to attract adherents, none conclusive enough to end debate decisively. And so Atlantis enters its mature phase as a permanent, unresolved mystery, suspended between what Plato wrote and what the earth stubbornly withholds, between the detailed testimony of antiquity's most respected philosopher and the comprehensive silence of archaeology and geology. After more than 2 millennia of searching, speculation, and scholarly debate, Certain facts stand out with crystalline clarity against the murk of interpretation and the fog of possibility. Atlantis remains confined to Plato's writings alone, appearing in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, but nowhere else in the extensive corpus of ancient literature that has survived to the present day. No other classical author provides an independent account of Atlantis or even mentions it except in reference to Plato's dialogues. No Egyptian papyrus has been discovered that confirms the priest's testimony Plato claims as his source indeed. No Egyptian text references Atlantis or the events Plato describes. No Phoenician inscription mentions an Atlantic empire despite that seafaring culture's extensive exploration and colonization. No archaeological site anywhere in the world has yielded artifacts or architecture that archaeologists and historians agree correspond to Plato's descriptions. The textual isolation is complete and striking. Atlantis exists in Plato's words, and demonstrably nowhere else in the surviving ancient record. Archaeology offers no confirmation despite technological advancement that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations of investigators. Modern archaeology can date organic materials with radiocarbon precision accurate to within years or decades for appropriate samples. Underwater exploration using sonar systems, submersibles, and remotely operated vehicles can map the ocean floor in extraordinary detail and investigate sites at depths impossible for human divers. Ground-penetrating radar can detect buried structures without excavation. Satellite imagery can identify landscape features invisible from ground level. DNA analysis can reconstruct ancient populations and trace their migrations and relationships. Trade goods can be sourced to their geographic origins through chemical and isotopic analysis. We have investigative tools that Plato could not have imagined, technologies that allow us to peer into the past with unprecedented clarity. Yet these tools have found no trace of Atlantis as described. The negative result is definitive only in showing what we haven't found, which is everything that would confirm Plato's account. This doesn't logically prove that nothing exists to be found. Absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, particularly for something claimed to have been utterly destroyed. But it does suggest with increasing force that if Atlantis existed, it was not where Plato said it was, not when he said it was, not what he described it as being. The silence becomes more eloquent with each technological advance that should make hidden civilizations easier to detect, but continues to find nothing Atlantean. Yet Atlantis has shaped philosophy, fiction, and alternative history movements far more powerfully than many confirmed civilizations whose archaeological reality is unquestioned. Plato's story has inspired utopian political thought from antiquity through the Renaissance to modernity. It motivated oceanic exploration during the Age of Discovery, when sailors ventured into the Atlantic, partly hoping to find Atlantean lands. It influenced geological speculation about catastrophism and the role of disasters in Earth history. It generated countless works of imaginative literature, from Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, reimagining Plato's story as a vision of scientific progress, to Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, depicting Atlantean ruins on the ocean floor, to modern fantasy and science fiction that continues to mine Atlantis for narrative possibilities. Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, published in 1882, argued for Atlantis as the origin point of all human civilization, influencing generations of alternative historians and giving the mystery new life in the modern era. The myth has proven culturally generative, even if perhaps especially because the historical reality remains elusive. Atlantis functions in human imagination and cultural production in ways that exceed what mere archaeological confirmation could provide. It serves needs that factual civilizations cannot serve, occupying a space in thought and creativity that depends on its ambiguous status between history and myth. If Atlantis existed, Atlantean voices are permanently lost. This is one of the most poignant aspects of the mystery and what distinguishes it from other ancient civilizations. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia or Greece, where we have texts written by the people themselves, where we can read their poetry and prayers and laws and business records and hear something of their actual voices and perspectives. Atlantis offers no such intimacy or direct access. We have only Plato's description, an outsider's account filtered through multiple layers of transmission. Egyptian priests to Solon, to his family, to Plato, telling us what Atlanteans supposedly did but never what they thought, how they understood themselves, what values they held, what stories they told about their own origins and meaning. If Atlantis was real, its people are silent in a way that even thoroughly destroyed civilizations usually are not. Troy fell violently, but left archaeological layers and entered Greek epic, where Trojan voices speak through Homer's poetry. Pompeii was buried by Vesuvius, but preserved graffiti, letters, and a frozen moment of ordinary life that speaks across centuries. Even prehistoric cultures, without writing, leave tools, art, burial practices that communicate something of their worldview. Atlantis, if it existed, left nothing, no voice, no art, no tools, no bones, no artifacts, nothing that would allow us to know the Atlanteans as people rather than as philosophical abstractions in Plato's narrative. The silence is total and humanly diminishing. If Atlantis was allegory, Plato's precise intent is obscured by time, by the incompleteness of Critias, by our distance from the intellectual and cultural context in which he wrote. We can reconstruct probable philosophical motives based on Plato's other works and what we know of 4th century BCE Athenian politics. He wanted to illustrate how moral corruption leads to political catastrophe, to contrast virtuous ancient Athens with corrupt contemporary Athens, to demonstrate that empires built on injustice inevitably fall. These motives are plausible and consistent with Plato's other writings. But did he intend readers to understand Atlantis as pure invention deployed for philosophical purposes, as historical memory shaped into narrative to serve his arguments, as something between fiction and history whose ambiguous status was itself philosophically meaningful? The text doesn't clarify, and Plato left no commentary explaining his narrative method or intent with this particular story. Teaching and testimony merge indistinguishably in Plato's narrative, creating interpretive ambiguity that may be accidental or may be deliberate. The story is presented as testimony inherited from Egyptian sources through Solon, yet it serves obvious teaching purposes about ethics and politics. Is it testimony deployed for teaching, or teaching disguised as testimony? The text allows both readings without clearly privileging either. This ambiguity might result from Plato's narrative method, which often blends different modes without clearly signaling transitions. Or it might be intentional, part of Plato's pedagogical approach that invites readers to question and investigate rather than passively receive answers. We cannot know, and this uncertainty is built into the text itself. Competing theories attempt to explain Atlantis, each accounting for some elements of the mystery, while leaving others unaddressed or requiring auxiliary assumptions. The moral allegory interpretation explains the ethical structure of Plato's account, the contrast between virtue and corruption, the inevitability of divine punishment for hybris, the political lessons about power and justice. It makes sense of why Plato would tell this story in his philosophical dialogues, but it struggles to explain why such an allegory would require such specific geographic and architectural details. The allegory of the cave doesn't include measurements. The ring of Gyges doesn't specify a real location. Why would a moral allegory need coordinates, dimensions, and material inventories unless it was also intended to make historical claims or draw on historical sources? Bronze Age collapse theories explain catastrophe and the sudden destruction of advanced civilizations, which did occur in the Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, when Mycenaean palaces fell and the Hittite Empire collapsed and trade networks disintegrated. These theories can point to actual archaeological evidence of sophisticated civilizations destroyed relatively suddenly, but they require assuming Plato's chronology is off by an order of magnitude, that his geography is wrong about the Atlantic location, that his scale is hugely exaggerated. If Atlantis is memory of Minoan Crete, or Mycenaean Greece distorted through centuries of oral transmission, we must explain how details changed so dramatically, how the Aegean became the Atlantic, how 900 years became 9,000, how a regional palace culture became a transatlantic empire. The theory salvages the possibility of historical basis while acknowledging that the memory has been transformed almost beyond recognition. Composite theories suggest Atlantis combines multiple ancient disasters and civilizations into a single narrative, that Plato or his sources unconsciously synthesized various cultural memories: Minoan collapse, Tartessian decline, flood myths from multiple traditions, stories of lost lands into one archetypal story. This explains how Atlantis can seem to have parallels with multiple historical events and places, while matching none precisely. It treats Plato as collating and condensing, rather than inventing or strictly recording. The theory is plausible, but inherently unfalsifiable. Any element of Atlantis can be explained by reference to some actual historical parallel, but the composite as a whole can never be confirmed as matching Plato's specific narrative. It explains why we find echoes, but never confirmation. Each theory explains fragments while sacrificing coherence with other aspects of the evidence or lack thereof. The moral allegory theory explains philosophical intent but not geographic specificity. The historical memory theory explains parallels with Bronze Age catastrophes but requires dismissing most of Plato's concrete details as corruption or exaggeration. The composite theory explains partial matches, but makes Atlantis so diffuse it loses specific historical content. No interpretation accounts for everything Plato tells us, while also explaining the complete archaeological absence, and this irreducible remainder keeps the mystery alive across generations. There is always something unexplained, always a gap between theory and text, always room for new interpretations. Atlantis becomes a tool reflecting cultural anxieties about decline, a mirror in which each age sees its own fears and concerns. When Plato wrote, Athens had recently been defeated in the Peloponnesian War and struggled with political instability. Atlantis reflected concerns about democratic corruption and imperial overreach. During the Age of Exploration, Atlantis represented lost knowledge and undiscovered lands, feeding European fantasies of finding ancient civilizations in newly mapped territories. In the modern era, particularly after the World Wars and in the Atomic Age, Atlantis has served as a warning about the destructive power of advanced technology, about civilizations that destroy themselves through their own sophistication. The story proves endlessly adaptable, able to carry whatever meaning contemporary audiences need it to carry, flexible enough to speak to changing concerns across millennia. Silence in the historical record acquires interpretive weight equal to evidence in discussions of Atlantis, transforming absence into a kind of presence that must be accounted for. The fact that we haven't found Atlantis becomes as significant in debates as the fact that we have found Troy or Mycenae or Knossos. The void Atlantis leaves is a shaped void, one with specific dimensions determined by Plato's description, one we can discuss and theorize about and project our ideas onto. In this sense, Atlantis is more productive of thought and speculation than many confirmed archaeological sites, precisely because its absence invites imagination in ways that presence would constrain. We know what Troy was and how it fell. We can only imagine what Atlantis might have been and how it supposedly vanished. The aftermath of Plato's story is not resolution but permanent suspension between competing interpretations that cannot be reconciled or decisively eliminated. The question, did Atlantis exist, has not been answered definitively and perhaps cannot be answered with the kind of evidence that would satisfy both skeptics and believers. We are left in the gap between text and world, between what Plato wrote and what archaeology reveals, in a space where neither philosophy nor geology can provide complete answers that command universal acceptance. This gap is not a bug in our understanding, but perhaps a feature of the mystery itself, the very thing that keeps Atlantis alive and compelling. that makes it perpetually interesting, that ensures each generation will reconsider the question and propose new solutions or new reasons why the question cannot be solved. The Atlantic horizon beyond the Pillars of Hercules remains unchanged from Plato's time to ours, as it has for the millennia between, constant and indifferent to human speculation. The sea stretches westward beneath the pale sky just as it always has, water meeting air in an uninterrupted line that suggests both infinity and emptiness, both possibility and absence. Ships pass through the Strait of Gibraltar now by the hundreds daily, crossing between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic on journeys that ancient sailors would have found miraculous in their ease, safety, and routine predictability. Modern vessels chart their courses with GPS satellite navigation, cross oceans in days that would have taken ancient ships weeks or months if they dared attempt the voyage at all. Sonar systems map the ocean floor in extraordinary detail, revealing underwater mountain ranges and abyssal plains and the features of plate tectonics. Satellites photograph the surface from space with resolution sufficient to detect individual ships and track ocean currents and temperatures. Yet for all this technology, for all this scrutiny, for all the eyes, both human and electronic, that have surveyed these waters, the Atlantic offers no confirmation and no denial of what Plato claimed existed somewhere beyond the Pillars. The sea is simply sea water over stone, currents driven by wind and temperature differential, marine life following its own imperatives, without regard to human questions or historical mysteries. If Atlantis sank in these waters, the ocean absorbed it completely, leaving no trace that 2,000 years of searching with progressively more sophisticated technologies can detect. If Atlantis never existed, if it was always fiction or philosophical illustration, the ocean has no reason to protest this interpretation or signal its agreement. The water holds whatever truth there is in perfect indifferent silence, neither confirming Plato's story nor refuting it, simply being itself while humans project their needs, desires, and interpretations onto its depths. Human fascination with lost greatness intensifies with each failure to find proof, a paradox that reveals something profound about how we relate to the past and to the idea of lost golden ages. We are drawn to what is lost more powerfully than to what has been found and catalogued. Troy, once discovered and excavated and studied, became an important archaeological site, but it lost the mythic power it held when it was merely legendary, when people could imagine it however they wished without being constrained by archaeological reality. Atlantis, never found, remains a dream rather than a destination, a possibility rather than a place, a space where imagination can operate free from the constraints of physical evidence and archaeological consensus. The absence feeds the fascination in ways that presence never could. Each failed expedition, rather than diminishing interest or gradually eroding belief, makes the mystery more tantalizing by demonstrating that Atlantis is not easily found, that it will not yield to casual searching, that it keeps its secrets well, if indeed it has any secrets to keep. The difficulty of the search becomes proof of Atlantis's significance rather than evidence of its non-existence. Something easily found would be less worth finding. Something that has resisted discovery for millennia must be either very well hidden or very important, or both. The logic is circular but psychologically compelling, turning failure into a kind of negative confirmation. Atlantis becomes a symbol of forgotten achievement and cautionary collapse, carrying multiple meanings simultaneously without these meanings contradicting each other. It represents what humanity might accomplish at its height, the advanced technology that allowed construction of those concentric harbors, the political sophistication that managed a far-flung empire, the architectural grandeur of temples covered in precious metals, the agricultural abundance that supported a large population. This is Atlantis as aspiration, as proof that human civilization can achieve greatness, as evidence that we have done remarkable things in the past and might do so again. But simultaneously, Atlantis represents what humanity becomes when unchecked by virtue and when power corrupts, absolutely the moral decay that Plato describes, the hybris that invites divine punishment, the inevitable fall that follows imperial overreach. These meanings coexist, making Atlantis rhetorically useful for many purposes. We can invoke it to celebrate human potential or to warn about human failings, to imagine what has been lost to time or to caution against the pride that leads to destruction. It serves as both golden age and cautionary tale, both aspiration and warning, both celebration of achievement and reminder of fragility. This multivalence is part of what makes the story endure. It can be deployed to support different arguments, to speak to different concerns, to function in different intellectual and emotional registers, without exhausting its meaning or becoming fixed in a single interpretation. Plato's words outlast every proposed location, surviving when Minoan palaces crumble further, when Tartessian theories fall out of favor, when Antarctic expeditions find only ice and rock. The text endures because it is text-fixed, reproducible, transmitted through copying and translation across centuries, and now preserved in digital form that makes it more permanent than any physical monument. The physical world changes continuously. Earthquakes reshape coastlines. Erosion wears down even the most solid structures. Sea levels rise and fall. Entire landscapes transform. But Plato's description of Atlantis remains exactly as he wrote it, preserved in manuscripts and now in countless printed editions and digital formats, permanent in a way that no physical place could be. This permanence of text over materiality is part of what makes the mystery ultimately insoluble. We keep comparing changing interpretations and new archaeological findings to unchanging words on a page, and the words always survive the comparison simply by remaining constant while our understanding and discoveries evolve. The text becomes the stable reference point against which all theories and all physical searches are measured, and because the text is both detailed and ambiguous, both specific and open to interpretation, it can outlast any number of failed attempts to match it to physical reality. Geography refuses to cooperate with narrative certainty, stubbornly declining to produce the concentric harbors, the sunken island, the evidence of transatlantic empire that would confirm Plato's account. The Atlantic Ocean doesn't hide a sunken continent despite early theories that it might. The Mediterranean seafloor doesn't conceal a metropolis matching Plato's architectural descriptions. The distance from the Pillars of Hercules to any substantial landmass doesn't correspond to ancient sailing ranges in the ways Plato's narrative would require. If read literally as a voyage account, physical reality constrains interpretation in ways that text does not. And when text and geography conflict, we must either abandon the literal reading or propose increasingly elaborate explanations for why geography doesn't match the narrative. The mystery survives because resolution would diminish possibility, would close off interpretive space that has proven remarkably generative for human thought and culture. If we found Atlantis tomorrow, if underwater archaeology discovered the concentric harbors, the orichalcum, the inscriptions proving this was Plato's city, what would we gain? Archaeological knowledge, certainly. Historical confirmation of ancient testimony, perhaps insights into Bronze Age or earlier civilizations. But we would lose the mystery itself, the endless possibility that currently exists. The story would become history, fixed and knowable and finite, no longer capable of meaning whatever each age needs it to mean. Atlantis would join Troy and Pompeii in the category of found cities, important but no longer mysterious, real but no longer magical. Atlantis resists classification as either fiction or history, existing in a liminal category that is simultaneously both and neither. It is fiction in that we have no physical evidence it existed, in that it may have been invented entirely by Plato for philosophical purposes. It is history in that it was presented as historical testimony, in that ancient and medieval readers often treated it as factual, in that it claims to report actual events, even if those claims are unverified. It is philosophy in that it serves Plato's ethical arguments regardless of its historical status. It is myth in that it functions culturally, the way myths function, carrying meaning beyond literal factuality, serving as an archetypal story about civilization and collapse. All these categories apply, yet none fully captures what Atlantis has become across millennia. It occupies its own unique space in human culture, the unverifiable, the permanently possible, the question that cannot be settled, because evidence is lacking, and because the text itself seems designed to resist final interpretation. It is both more and less than a historical claim, more in its cultural impact and endurance, less in its empirical support and archaeological reality. The story endures as an unanswered inquiry rather than a solved problem. And this endurance itself is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire Atlantis phenomenon. More than 2,000 years after Plato wrote, we are still discussing this narrative, still proposing new theories about where Atlantis might have been or what it might have been, still searching coastlines and ocean floors, still debating whether Plato meant history or allegory. The durability of the question exceeds the durability of most answers in human history. Atlantis has outlived the ancient Greek civilization that produced the story, outlived the Roman Empire, outlived countless dynasties and nations and belief systems. The question persists when so much else has vanished, when civilizations that were unquestionably real have been forgotten or reduced to archaeological footnotes. This persistence reveals something essential about human nature and our relationship to the past, to mystery, to the idea of lost greatness. We need mysteries that resist solution. We need stories of golden ages that once existed but can no longer be reached. We need narratives about great civilizations that fell because they suggest our own civilization's achievements matter, that collapse has causes we might understand and avoid, that history offers lessons if we're wise enough to learn them. We need the possibility of discovery, the hope that somewhere in unexplored archives or beneath unexplored seas lies confirmation of stories too compelling to dismiss as mere invention. We need, perhaps, to believe that the past holds more than we currently know, that history is not fully mapped and understood, that wonder and mystery still have space to operate in an age of satellite surveillance and genetic sequencing and scientific certainty. Somewhere between what Plato recorded and what the Earth withheld, Atlantis found a way to disappear that ensured it would never be forgotten, that guaranteed its immortality precisely through its absence. It disappeared not as a place, though Plato describes it, sinking beneath the waves in a catastrophic day and night, but as a permanent question mark in human knowledge, a gap that consciousness cannot close but also cannot ignore. It disappeared into the space between philosophy and history, between teaching and testimony, between metaphor and memory, occupying a liminal zone that makes it impossible to dismiss, but equally impossible to confirm. It disappeared so thoroughly that we cannot prove it ever existed. No ruins, no artifacts, no corroborating texts, no genetic or linguistic legacy. Yet it disappeared so incompletely that we cannot prove it didn't exist. The text remains. The geographic possibility exists, however, improbably. The historical parallels with Bronze Age catastrophes suggest some kernel might underlie the elaboration. And in that liminal space between existence and non-existence, between fact and fiction, between what was written and what is real, Atlantis learned to live forever, to survive every failed search by retreating into possibility, to outlast every skeptical dismissal by remaining unfalsified. The waves continue their ancient rhythm against the pillars of Hercules, as they did in Plato's time, as they will long after our own age has passed into the same contested memory that surrounds Atlantis itself. The Atlantic extends westward, keeping whatever secrets the deep may hold, or keeping the secret that there are no secrets, that the depths contain exactly what geology says they contain. Sea floor created at mid-ocean ridges, seamounts of volcanic origin, abyssal plains covered in sediment, but no sunken civilizations, no concentric harbors, no temples to Poseidon covered in precious metals. We cannot know which interpretation is correct because the ocean, vast and deep and largely unexplored despite all our technology, declines to answer definitively. Scholars continue to debate what Plato meant, producing academic papers and books that approach the same ancient texts from new theoretical angles, applying new methodologies, reaching conclusions that somehow never quite settle the question to everyone's satisfaction. Enthusiasts continue to search for Atlantis, armed now with sonar and submersibles and satellite imagery that earlier generations could not have imagined, yet finding the same essential absence that has always been found: interesting geological features, underwater formations that momentarily excite before being explained as natural rather than artificial, nothing that confirms Plato's specific descriptions. Skeptics continue to dismiss the entire enterprise as misguided and pseudo-scientific, as a failure to understand how philosophical allegory worked in ancient texts, as wasted effort that could be better spent on civilizations we know existed. And still the mystery endures, renewed with each generation that discovers Plato's dialogues and wonders. And Atlantis endures, not as a place on any map, but as a question that has learned to survive every answer. A mystery that has discovered its power lies not in being solved, but in remaining forever, just beyond the reach of proof, forever possible, forever lost. It endures because we need it to endure, because something in human nature requires mysteries that resist solution, golden ages that remain tantalizingly out of reach, questions that cannot be answered but only perpetually reconsidered. It endures as the perfect embodiment of absence that has become more real than presence, of a civilization that may never have existed yet refuses to die, of silence that speaks more loudly than evidence. Perhaps Plato understood this when he wrote his dialogues, understood that the most powerful stories are not those that answer questions, but those that pose questions that cannot be answered. Not those that provide closure, but those that open spaces for endless interpretation. Perhaps he deliberately created a mystery that would outlive his philosophy, a narrative that would be remembered when his arguments about justice and the forms were studied only by specialists. Or perhaps he simply told a story to make a philosophical point and never imagined that 2,000 years later, people would be searching ocean floors and debating whether he meant to describe a real place or construct an instructive fiction. We cannot ask him. His words survive, but his voice is silent as the Atlanteans he described, as silent as the ocean that may or may not hold ruins beneath its depths. And so we are left where Plato left us, between what was written and what exists, between possibility and proof, contemplating an absence that has become the most present of mysteries, a civilization that may never have existed, yet refuses to be forgotten, a question that survives because the ocean, vast and indifferent and endlessly patient, declines to answer it. The question endures. The mystery remains. And somewhere in the space between knowledge and wonder, between history and imagination, between what Plato meant and what generations have understood, Atlantis continues its strange existence, neither real nor unreal, neither truth nor fiction, but something more durable than either, a permanent possibility, a forever maybe, an eternal question mark inscribed on the horizon where sea meets sky, where the known world ended and the Atlantic begins, where Plato placed his lost civilization, and where more than 2 millennia later, we still cannot prove it was never there. The shadows lengthen across the pillars of Hercules. The tide comes in and goes out, as it has for ages beyond counting, and Atlantis remains what it has always been since Plato wrote. Not a place to be found, but a question to be pondered. Not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be carried forward into whatever future awaits human curiosity and wonder. The question beneath the waves endures, and perhaps that endurance, more than any discovery of ruins could be, is Atlantis's true legacy. The demonstration that sometimes what we cannot find teaches us more than what we can, that absence can be as powerful as presence, that the most lasting stories are those that refuse to end, that live forever in the space between what was written and what the earth refuses to reveal. And so Atlantis learned to disappear not as a place beneath the waves, but as a question history can never fully answer, as a mystery that grows stronger with each failed attempt to solve it, as an absence that has become more real than countless presences, as proof that sometimes the most powerful truths are those that remain forever just beyond our grasp, suspended between the known and the unknowable, between the written word and the silent sea.